Hello, everybody. My name is Amy Peikoff, and you're watching News Sandwich. This is where I try to make the news more palatable by sandwiching the bad news in between two items of good news. So thanks for joining me. If you're joining me live, if you're joining me later with the recording, hello to you as well. I am going to be over here at YouTube looking for the comments in the chat and everybody. I think people can hear me, right? I'm not seeing any complaints yet. So welcome. The good news for today, actually there's been some breaking news this morning, which has been that there have been explosive devices sent to Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and CNN. And we could weave that a little bit into the bad news that we have for today, because I think it's kind of a piece with that. But that had not been my plan today. My plan had been to talk about tax cuts, which, sort of in the grand scheme of sending explosive devices around doesn't seem as important, but I think nobody's been hurt, which is a good thing. And as I said, we can sort of weave that into the bad news. So see what you think of it. But the good news again is you might be getting a tax cut from Donald Trump. And if you're like me, you believe that involuntary taxation is theft. Remember when everybody used to talk about taxation is theft all the time? Somehow it doesn't apply to Trump's tariffs, but in any event, I think a lot of us are on the idea that money is much better off in your pocket spent by you than in the government's pocket spent by them. We would like it, of course, if tax cuts would go along with government spending cuts, right? That would be one thing. We would also like it if this was done on principle, where you have Donald Trump out there actually talking about the fact that your money belongs to you, that you are entitled to the fruits of your labor, to the benefits of your productive effort. But instead, what we see is that this is an election eve promise in order to gain votes. Somehow, I guess, over the weekend, he decided when he was at one of his rallies that in order to really motivate people, he should promise them something that they really wanted, and that is a tax cut. So you might get, as a result of this, a 10% tax cut. 10% of the money that would go to the government is otherwise going to stay in your pocket, and you could do some good things with it. So that's the good news. The bad news is how this has come about. As I hinted, this was just announced out of the blue over the weekend. And so Washington Post today, when I went there and visited, they had a headline, "In the service of Whim, officials scramble to make Trump's false assertions real." And this was the top example in the story, the tax cut, because apparently there had not been any discussion with any of the officials on Capitol Hill, nor in Donald Trump's administration. This was some sort of whim that he had over the weekend that he decided he was going to go ahead and announce this. The article also goes on to say that the White House has released no substantive information. And importantly, although tax cutting requires legislation, Congress is not scheduled to be back in session until after the November 6th election. So he's promising this, not having discussed it with anybody. And, then the question is, so Amy, why is this bad news? Tax cuts are great, right? Tax cuts are good news. We're going to have money in our pocket. Why do you care so much? I care because this is, as I see it, another step down the road that Barack Obama was taking when he was in office. If you remember, Barack Obama, when he was trying to achieve certain things in legislation and he was frustrated time and again, he actually at a certain point later in his presidency got up and said, "Hey, Congress, if you're not going to give me what I want, I've got a pen and a phone," right? And a lot of us criticized Obama for that because, he's not supposed to do that. He's supposed to do it through legislation. And here I would say that we've gone one step further, that we've got Donald Trump saying, "Barack Obama, just hold my beer," okay? Because what he's done is he hasn't talked with any officials in his administration, anybody in Congress. He hasn't been bumping up against a wall. This is the first time anybody has heard of it. And then suddenly this is supposed to be a promise. So this is beyond what we've heard of before. There's one part of the article that I wanted to read to you a little bit because it called something to mind. there's an expert at the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania named Kathleen Jamieson. And she says, quote, virtually no one on the planet has the kind of power that a president of the United States has to scramble bureaucracies in the service of whim. And as you could tell from the headline, really the whole story is about a number of times that Trump has said something and then had administration officials scrambling to make it so. And sometimes they didn't succeed. So, for example, when he asserted that there was some evidence that Middle Easterners had infiltrated into this caravan that's coming up through the border, that's also a big election issue, right? He had to finally admit, Trump had to finally admit this morning that there was no evidence. And then he says, there is no evidence, but there could be, right? Which we can get to in a second, the implications of that. But going on with what Jamieson has said, she says, quote, whatever Donald Trump wakes up and thinks about, or whatever comes to mind in the middle of a speech, actually has the reality in that it is actionable in some odd sense, end quote. Now you could add to that tweeting, right? Sometimes he tweets things and then he's going to have everybody scrambling to make it so as well. But this reminded me of I don't know if you've read Orwell's 1984. If you haven't read Orwell's 1984, you really need to. If you haven't read it in a long time, maybe reread it, because I am seeing shades of Orwell all over a lot of the things that Trump does. The society that they have of, I'm trying to actually, Oceania. Oceania is the socialist society that they have there. I always remember the enemies, Eurasia and East Asia and stuff, and I forget the name of the country that you're supposed to be in 1984. Anyway, there's the one scene where there's a government official giving a speech at some huge rally. Everybody is mandated, of course, to go to these rallies. We're not there yet, right? But everyone's mandated. They're all sitting there listening to this government official. And there's all sorts of banners up about the ongoing war with either Eurasia or East Asia. I forget which one it was. Right in the middle of a speech, this official in 1984 just changes. He's given a note. He's given a note telling him, okay, now, even though before we were at war with Eurasia, now we're at war with East Asia. And so just without missing a beat, in the middle of the speech, this official, instead of using the term Eurasia for referring to the enemy, just uses East Asia, as if nothing has changed. It's always been that way. We've always been at war with East Asia. We were never at war with Eurasia. And that's really what Trump is doing. It's, there has never been a proposal for a 10% middle class tax cut, but suddenly there's a reality to it because in the middle of the speech, Donald Trump has the whim and he just talks about it. So there's that as well. In terms of the rule of law, this is what comes to mind. And I was having some discussion with this on my social media thread this morning. And some people were saying, well, what does this really have to do with the rule of law? Because after all, there is going to have to be legislation at a certain point. And my point again is that he has not gone through any sort of proper procedure at all before trying to promise this. He hasn't even run it by anybody in his administration or officials in Congress or anything. He's just going to promise it to voters in some way, as if it's got some possibility of really happening. If you study philosophy of law, and I've taught a philosophy of law seminar, and maybe I'm going to teach it again online. I'm still, sort of mulling that around in my mind. There's one paper that's a beautiful paper by a philosopher named Lon Fuller, and it's called The 8 Ways to Fail to Make Law. And it talks about the importance of procedure for making law. And in fact, Lon Fuller, in the famous debate between sort of natural law theory and what they call positivism, in natural law theory, they say there is a connection between morality and law. In positivism, they say they don't. There is no necessary connection. Law is law, whatever, kind of jumps through the proper procedural hoops goes. Lon Fuller has been, in his article, he talked about what's called procedural morality. And he talks about certain requirements for something to be law, that it has to be clear and intelligible, it has to be published, it has to be internally consistent in a certain way, it has to be administered consistently. There's 8 different requirements that you have to go through. And here, we have, Trump going beyond, as I say, Barack Obama. Everybody criticized Obama because he was going to take out the pen and the phone and make something happen when he had been banging his head up against the wall legislatively. And now we have Donald Trump before he's ever even gone through the process and been shunned. And you could say, okay, well, tax cuts are good. I could see where, there's a tax cut. Everybody deserves a tax cut. He's very frustrated. And so, let's go ahead and do it. Before any of that happens, he's just out there promising it as if, that it is actually possible. So this is, as I said, a step beyond, without real respect for the rule of law. And I saw some Trump supporters this morning saying, well, tax cuts are good. How can you argue with tax cuts? And I want to just kind of point back to some immigration debate that I had with people, because when in the state of California, some California officials were thwarting the efforts of the Trump administration to really crack down on some illegal immigrants who were here just being productive citizens and working. They would go to the workplaces and do raids and maybe imprison or deport a bunch of them and stuff like that. And some California government officials were giving warnings and helping people evade this effort. And I was sympathetic to that. People say, well, aren't you an advocate for the rule of law? The rule of law requires 2 things: good substance. And yeah, with tax cuts, you could say, other things being equal, that it goes along with some sort of fiscal discipline, et cetera, that tax cuts are good things. But it also requires proper procedure. And when you see a president going further down the path established by Barack Obama and saying, not only am I going to whip out my pen and my phone after I have been frustrated by Congress, but also I'm just going to start announcing policies. I'm going to promise them to people so that they'll be disappointed if they don't get it. I'll announce it right during the middle of a campaign speech. That, to me, is a signal that the rule of law is not valued as much anymore. So I see it overall as bad news. Jennifer over here in the comments says, maybe Trump has a magic wand. I think he sure wishes that he did. He certainly does wish that he did. Apparently, Trump is now a proponent of listen and believe. And Unchelco says, I want the philosophy of law course. Yeah, I would definitely love it. As I said, when I'm reading things out there, things that I've taught in the philosophy of law course come to mind often. So yeah. So is this a whim? I think it's probably some sort of whim. Some people were saying, well, what if it was part of a considered policy proposal in Trump's mind? I have never seen Trump announce tax cuts on principle in terms of your money belongs to you. You have a right to your money. Instead, it's really about buying votes and about satisfying demands, getting votes. And that's really what this is about. So I'm very cynical about it. And I think you should be too. So that's the bad news. The bad news is the origin of this. What does it have to do with the attempted bombings that we've seen today? What we're seeing more and more is that any sort of proper political process is being set aside or shunned by the right. I'm assuming that we've got people on the right who are responsible for this. Kudos to Trump, by the way. So Trump, and he followed Pence. Mike Pence was out there on Twitter, pretty much right away, denouncing whoever it is that's responsible for this, and promising to hold them accountable. And Trump says, I agree 100%. So good for him. But he's the one who was out there saying that the press is the enemy of the people, and promising that Hillary Clinton should be in prison and all, crooked Hillary and everything else. I don't know exactly if he ever said anything bad, like that about Obama, but there's language that he does that potentially gives some sort of justification to those elements. But again, as I said, I'm glad he's out there denouncing it. We cannot give up on this idea of going through civilized debate, having a proper political process, in order to actually save this country. If we've decided that we're at the point of revolution, then the place to do it is not through government and, don't do it some, kind of covertly and stuff. Let's go ahead and then, I guess, declare a revolution. But I don't think we're there yet. I think we still have hope for civil discourse. And, let's all keep a handle on it, people. And let's criticize a president, like I said, who is going down. I mean, what did you do? People who are Trump supporters, I'll ask you this. What did you do when Barack Obama said, "I've got a pen and a phone"? And think about how critical you were of that. And as I said, it's a further step down the road to say, oh yeah, we're going to have tax cuts. And what are they going to do? They're going to try to pass some sort of resolution before the elections. We promise that you might get a tax cut if you elect us. That's what the GOP is going to do. So then you say, okay, so Amy, what is the good news? The good news is that we do have press outlets who are explicitly denouncing this sort of thing, explicitly denouncing the setting aside of the rule of law, insisting on the adherence to proper procedure, and calling this sort of thing whim. That in effect, Trump has a whim. He announces it, and then his administration is going around scrambling to make it so, and that they're able to come up with other examples. One thing you might wish is that they would be very explicit about the arbitrary, because as I said, this morning he was forced to admit that contrary to the assertion that he put out there, and his administration's efforts to scramble around and see if they had evidence for his assertion, there is no evidence that Middle Easterners have infiltrated this caravan that is coming up to the border. So nonetheless, even though he was forced to admit that, then he tried to say, but still it's possible. This is what he says. And here's the quote from Trump. "There's no proof of anything, but there could very well be." He's hanging on to what in philosophy we would call an arbitrary assertion. He's making that assertion without evidence. And as I said, yes, you could improve on the press by having them actually call that issue out explicitly, but at least they are hammering him on going out there and making assertions based on whim that have no basis at all in any sort of official administrative action, any data that he's familiar with, etc. They're holding his feet to the fire on this. And that's what the press really should be doing. What we need to do is remember this so that if and when Trump fails and we have a Warren or somebody equally as bad taking over, that if she tries to do the same sort of thing, that we can go to the media and say, hey, you really should criticize her for it as well, not just when the opposing party is in office. Ronald says, is it bad that I want him to say on a whim, no more taxes? Yes, I would say it is bad. I mean, well, okay, it's not bad that you want it, right? I'm not going to be in the business of telling you to deny your feelings and emotions. I used to think, I was listening to Rush Limbaugh some years ago. Wouldn't it be fun if Limbaugh, who understood, I think at one point, the immorality of involuntary taxation, wouldn't it be great if he just called for his whole audience to do a conscientious protest of taxation? So everybody one year just said, forget it, we're not going to pay our taxes. His audience was millions of listeners. So try to put all of those people in jail, et cetera. It'd be very, very difficult. So I used to have, kind of a fleeting wish for that. I don't think it's bad, but would it be bad if he actually did that? Yes, it would be bad that he did that. Now people are wanting to get me into the discussion about the caravan. The fact that there's 7K plus strong marching to the border is a catastrophe, not just for America, but for Mexico as well. Do you know how small a percentage of the total population of United States 7,000 is? This is not a catastrophe. We really need to save catastrophic language for something that really is a catastrophe. Gary says, rule by lie is lawlessness. Yes, yes. So, I mean, this is an extension of the fact that Trump is known for not always having any respect for reality. As I said, I just quoted you there. He says, there is no evidence for it, but there could be evidence. If you say there could be something, it's like, I could have cancer. Well, I should have some evidence for that I could point to you before I ever say anything like that. What is he going to say statistically or something? So in proper logic, for you to say that something could be true, you should have at least some little bit of evidence. And he doesn't have respect for that requirement at all. And apparently he doesn't have respect for the idea that before making any promises to voters or constituents, that you should, sort of run by Congress or your administration officials whether the thing is actually feasible to do at all. Because, what does he want to do? He wants to stir up a demand for this. And he wants to make pragmatism rule entirely. Everybody's going to demand the tax cut that he promised. And he's hoping that all of the politicians, or enough of the politicians, will go along with him in the style of pragmatism and believe that it's their duty just to satisfy demand, regardless of whether it's the right thing to do. So kudos to Washington Post for holding up some standards about this, calling Trump out for acting in the service of Whim. What I say to you, Washington Post, is be warned, because if Trump loses his majority and is replaced in 2020 by somebody in your party, we're going to expect you to hold that person to the same standards. So everybody, that is your news sandwich. I'm out of here unless I see some other questions over here in the YouTube chat. I want to keep these short and sweet. Metaphors be with you. I love that handle. Metaphors be with you says, glad to see you on, Tucker. Again, you're fantastic. Thank you so much. I really had a good time. And I hope that they'll have me again, whether remote or in studio or anything else. I like talking to him. And yeah, I like talking to him in the debate style where we're going at it, and also in the friendly style. Either way, as long as I get to go there and discuss some interesting topics, he always gives me interesting topics to discuss. So everybody, thank you. I'm out of here. I'm going to be here next week, I believe, on Tuesday with Yaron Brook for a Yaron and Amy show, and then on Wednesday with another news sandwich. And I'm going to try to also get a Patreon Q&A in there. So I'll put a post over at my Patreon. By the way, if you're not a patron, please go to my Patreon page. There's a link at the bottom of the YouTube, right under, the YouTube video. You'll be able to see a link to my Patreon page. Become a patron. You'll be able to ask me a question in the Q&A. So thank you. Become a patron, share, all the usual stuff. And I will see you either, probably maybe Monday for a Q&A, Tuesday with Yaron, Wednesday for a new sandwich. Okay. Take care, everybody.